If you stare into the darkness for long enough, she starts looking at you. You can't save them all.
You know you're going the wrong way.
You promised you'd come back.
The marshland stretched endlessly before them, its damp earth swallowing the sound of their footsteps. The father led the way, his bow slung across his back, his eyes scanning the tall reeds and twisted branches ahead. The son followed a few steps behind, gripping the strap of his small backpack. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and decay, and somewhere in the distance, the low croak of a frog echoed through the stillness. Hunting had become harder. The animals were learning, adapting, just as the people had. Some had moved deeper into the wilderness, beyond where it was safe to follow. Others had grown wary, their senses sharper, their movements faster. The father knew it wouldn't be long before even the smallest creatures learned that men were the real predators here. They walked in silence, their breath fogging in the early morning chill. Then the sound came, faint, distant, a rustling in the woods. Both of them froze. The father raised a hand, signaling his son to stop. Slowly, he pulled the binoculars from his coat pocket and brought them to his eyes. Through the lens, he scanned the trees, pausing when he caught movement near a cluster of dead ferns. A wild pig. It rooted through the damp earth, oblivious to their presence. The father lowered the binoculars and motioned for his son to get low. They sank to their knees and began crawling forward, the mud soaking into their clothes. The father reached back, palm open. Without a word, the son slid the bow and an arrow into his hand. The father shifted his weight, moving with practiced precision. He placed the arrow against the string, pulled back, and aimed. The world around him narrowed. He exhaled slowly, fingers steady, heart quiet. Then he released. The arrow struck. The pig let out a sharp cry and bolted. The father cursed under his breath and rose to his feet, already moving. The son followed, tracking the splashes of red on the ground. The blood trail was easy to follow at first, winding through the reeds and into the trees. They moved quickly, anticipation tightening their chests. Then the trail stopped. The son looked around, confused. The ground was wet, the mud shifting under his feet. The pig had entered the swamp. The water rippled slightly, the only trace of its passage. The father clenched his jaw. "Damn thing's gone," he muttered. They stood there for a moment, staring at the dark water, waiting, hoping for movement. But there was nothing. The son exhaled sharply and kicked a loose branch into the swamp. It sank without a trace. "Come on," the father said, turning back. The disappointment was bitter, but they didn't have time to waste. The sun was climbing higher, and they still had a long way home. They moved through the marsh, stepping over fallen branches and muddy pools, their feet sinking slightly with each step. The hunger gnawed at them, but there was nothing to be done about it now. Then the son spotted it, a child's shoe half buried in the mud. He stopped. "Dad." The father turned. His eyes followed where the boy was pointing. He walked over, crouched down, and picked up the small, dirt-caked shoe. It was worn, torn at the seams, the kind a child would have outgrown years ago if time still allowed for such things. The son shifted uncomfortably. "You think someone's nearby?" The father didn't answer. Instead, he straightened and scanned the area, his eyes sharp. Then he saw it, the faintest imprint of footprints leading away. A trail barely visible, but there nonetheless. Without a word, he started following it. They walked in silence, the tension between them thick. The son kept his eyes on the ground, tracking each print, each broken branch. Then, up ahead, the glint of something metal caught his eye. A car. It sat in the middle of the overgrown road, its paint faded, its windows cracked. Vines had begun to creep over its hood, nature reclaiming what once belonged to man. The father approached cautiously, placing a hand on the door handle. It creaked loudly as he pulled it open. The inside smelled of mildew and rot. The seats were torn, the stuffing spilling out. A long-forgotten scent of leather and old metal clung to the air. The father began searching through the glove compartment, the son checking beneath the seats. The father found a cigarette butt, yellowed and old but still recognizable. The son, meanwhile, pulled something from under the seat, a small, crumbling biscuit. He stared at it for a long moment before slowly bringing it to his mouth. The stale crumbs hit his tongue, and he barely chewed before swallowing. His stomach clenched, desperate for more. He ate another piece, then another, ignoring the dry, chalky taste. Then, a sharp sound, a jarring, deafening blast that sent a shock through the air. The car horn. The son's breath caught in his throat. He looked down, realizing his elbow had hit the steering wheel. Then came the howls, low and distant at first, then closer, answering one another in a chorus of hunger. The father spun toward the trees, gripping his bow. "Wolves," he murmured. They moved quickly. The father climbed into the driver's seat, the son crawling into the passenger side. They shut the doors, locking them with quiet clicks. Outside, the marshland fell silent. Then, in the distance, the shifting of underbrush. The wolves were coming. The son's fingers curled into fists, the father barely breathed. The only sound was the wind, the slow drip of water from the trees. Then, nothing. The wolves passed. The father exhaled, his grip loosening. The son leaned his head against the seat, the exhaustion settling into his bones. They would wait here, just for a while. Then, when the world was still again, they would move. They left before the sun had fully risen, slipping away from the abandoned car in silence. The cold air bit at their faces as they walked through the marsh, their feet sinking into the damp ground. The father moved with purpose, leading the way back home. The son followed, chewing the last of the stale biscuit he had found, his stomach still hollow with hunger. He crumpled the empty wrapper in his palm and, without thinking, let it fall to the ground. The journey home felt longer than usual. The wind carried distant sounds, the snapping of branches, the rustling of unseen animals in the undergrowth. The father kept his grip on his bow, his eyes scanning every shadow. The son's hands were deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. When they reached the house, they moved carefully, slipping between the layers of branches that concealed their shelter. The father reached out, gripping a thick limb, and pulled it aside, revealing a narrow wooden door. They stepped inside quickly, closing the entrance behind them and replacing the branch. The dim interior smelled of damp wood and smoke. The son immediately turned toward the back of the room, where a pile of blankets lay in the corner. His girlfriend lay there, her face pale, her breathing shallow. She stirred at the sound of their arrival, but barely opened her eyes. He crouched beside her, pressing his hand to her forehead. She was warm, too warm. The father, meanwhile, set his things down and went straight to the metal pot they used for water. He took out a small plastic sheet, setting it over a pot of boiling water to catch condensation. The drips would collect in a separate container, giving them clean drinking water. It was a slow process, but it was the only way to stay alive. The son pulled a small bottle from his pocket, the last of her medicine. He placed it in her hand, watching as she weakly brought it to her lips. She swallowed, her eyelids fluttering. Then she was asleep again. The father sat down heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the cigarette butt he had found in the car. It was barely anything, just a scrap of tobacco and paper, but he didn't care. He lit it with a burning stick from the fire and stepped outside. The night was quiet, too quiet. He took a slow drag, the smoke curling around him, blending into the darkness. In the distance, he heard them, the wild things that lurked in the forest. A wolf's howl carried on the wind, the crunch of movement in the undergrowth. He exhaled and watched the smoke drift away. Morning came in a slow gray haze. The sun stretched, his back aching from the cold floor. He stepped outside, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and made his way toward the small makeshift toilet they had built a short distance from the house. As he reached it, he stopped. Something was wrong. His breath hitched as he saw them. A group of figures moving through the trees, their forms dark against the morning mist. They were coming straight for the house. Panic shot through him. He turned and sprinted back. "Dad?" The father was already moving. He grabbed the backpack they kept ready for emergencies, shoving supplies inside with practiced speed. He handed it to his son and went to the back of the house. With one sharp kick, he broke the wooden panel loose, revealing a narrow crawl space leading to the outside. He helped his son and the girl inside, then pressed the panel back into place, sealing them in. Then he turned to face the raiders. The door crashed open. The first man through barely had time to react before the father struck. His fist connected with the raider's jaw, sending him stumbling back. Another man lunged forward, swinging a crude knife. The father ducked, grabbing the raider's arm and twisting hard. A sickening snap echoed in the small space. But there were too many. A boot caught him in the ribs, knocking him to the ground. Hands grabbed at him, dragging him up. He struggled, landing a few more hits, but they overpowered him, forcing him to his knees. The leader stepped forward. He was a tall man, wrapped in layers of old coats, his face hidden behind a scarf. He crouched in front of the father, tilting his head as he studied him. Then, without a word, he reached down and grabbed the backpack. He searched through it, pausing when he found the bottle of medicine. He held it up, turning it in his fingers. His eyes flickered with understanding. Then he smiled. "Where is she?" he asked. The father clenched his jaw. He didn't answer. The leader sighed, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. He slid the bottle into his pocket and stood up. "Take him." Two men grabbed the father, pulling him to his feet. One of them yanked off his jacket, tossing it aside. Another tied his wrists behind his back. The father didn't struggle. Not yet. As they dragged him toward the trees, the leader paused near the toilet. He ran a gloved hand over the wooden hatch, then reached for the handle. Inside, the son pressed his back against the wood, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might give them away. The leader pulled, but the hatch didn't budge. He frowned and tried again. Still stuck. He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, peering through the cracks. A second later, he recoiled, gagging. "Disgusting," he muttered, stepping back. He turned away, shaking his head, and walked after his men. The son didn't move, didn't breathe. Only when the forest was silent again did he slowly push open the hatch. He stepped outside and scanned the area. The house was trashed, their supplies scattered, the fire pit overturned. His father was gone. Then he saw it, the biscuit wrapper, lying near the door. His chest tightened. He had led them here. His carelessness had cost them everything. He clenched his fists. His father was gone, his girlfriend's medicine stolen, and now he had to fix it. The son sat on the cold ground, his fingers digging into the dirt, his mind a storm of thoughts. His father was gone. The medicine was gone. His girlfriend, trapped inside the house, was running out of time. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had no choice. He had to go after them. The house needed to stay hidden. If he failed, she would be their last hope. He grabbed more branches and stacked them around the shelter, weaving them into the existing camouflage. He found a roll of plastic, cutting strips and wrapping them around his feet. His boots had long since fallen apart, and he had no time to find replacements. It was a crude solution, but it would have to do. Inside, his girlfriend groaned, shifting weakly under the blankets. He knelt beside her, brushing damp hair from her forehead. She opened her eyes, barely conscious. "I'll be back," he whispered. She didn't answer. He placed a photo of his father in his pocket, sealed the house, and set off. The first steps away from safety were the hardest. The wind howled through the empty trees, carrying the distant sounds of animals moving unseen. He walked for hours, following the direction the raiders had taken, his body numb from hunger and exhaustion. When he couldn't go any further, he collapsed onto the frozen earth, curling up against the cold. He dreamed of warmth, of food, of the life he used to have. But when he woke, all that remained was the endless stretch of dead land. He kept moving. The footprints he followed grew fainter, but the signs were still there. Broken branches, dried blood smeared on bark. They were dragging his father. He pressed on, his legs aching. Then in the distance, movement. A boy. The sun froze. The boy was small, younger than him, wrapped in rags. Their eyes met. The boy turned and ran. "Wait," the son called, but the boy was gone, disappearing into the ruins of an old house. The son hesitated before following. Inside, the house was almost bare. A single door at the back swung slightly, revealing a dimly lit room. The boy's father sat inside, frail and motionless, his skin pale. The son didn't wait. He grabbed a pair of trousers draped over a chair, then spotted a single shoe on the ground. He took that too, along with a worn jacket. He didn't feel guilty. The boy had food. The old man was alive. They were better off than him. He left without another word. Back outside, he stumbled upon a trail of blood. He followed it cautiously. Soon he found a small fire pit, the embers still warm. He looked closer. Human bones. His stomach twisted. He staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. It could be his father. He collapsed to his knees, retching, his body convulsing with grief. He wanted to run, to pretend he hadn't seen this, to believe his father was still alive somewhere, but the truth clawed at his mind. Still, he couldn't leave the bones out like this. Whoever they belonged to deserved better. With shaking hands, he scraped at the dirt, burying what remained. He placed a rock over the shallow grave. It wasn't enough, but it was all he could do. Then he kept going. Climbing a tall tree, he scanned the horizon. Smoke. It rose in thin wisps from beyond the hills. It had to be the raiders. He gritted his teeth and climbed higher to get a better view. Then the branch snapped. He crashed to the ground, pain shooting through his body. His ankle throbbed. He groaned, rolling onto his side, trying to assess the damage. Then he heard them. The wolves. They had heard the fall. They were coming. He scrambled for his flint, striking it against a rock, trying to light a fire. Sparks caught on dried leaves. A flame flickered to life. He fed it quickly, forcing it to grow. The wolves arrived moments later, circling him. Their eyes glowed in the darkness. He gripped a burning stick and swung it wildly. They hesitated, snarling, but didn't dare attack. The fire was the only thing keeping them at bay. Hours passed before they finally left. He spent the night there, curled beside the fire, unable to sleep. His body ached. His stomach screamed for food, but he ignored it. He was too close to stop now. At dawn, he continued toward the smoke. On the way, he found a small tent. He approached carefully, throwing a stone at it. No movement. He opened it, searching inside. A few pieces of cloth, an empty water bottle, a match, a pocket knife, a dog whistle. He stuffed them all into his bag. As he stepped outside, the boy from before appeared again. Their eyes met for only a second before the boy ran. He didn't chase him. Reaching a river, he crouched behind a tree and watched as a woman knelt by the water, washing knives. She worked methodically, her movements calm. Then she filled a bottle and left. He followed her at a distance. She led him straight to the raider camp. The camp was a mess of old trailers and makeshift tents, surrounded by discarded bones and scavenged supplies. He spotted his backpack near one of the trailers. His heart pounded. His father had been here. Waiting until nightfall, he moved carefully, sneaking past a tripwire meant to alert the raiders. Inside the trailer, he searched frantically. The backpack was there, but when he tore through it, the medicine was gone. Then the door opened. The woman stood there, a knife in hand. She lunged at him. He dodged, but she was fast, tackling him to the ground. They rolled, struggling for control. She clawed at his face, kicking, trying to stab him. He grabbed a nearby rock and swung. She collapsed. Blood pooled beneath her head. He stared at her, breathless. Then he forced himself to move. Dragging her body, he wiped the blood from the floor, then carried her outside, hiding behind a tree. He watched as the raiders returned, dragging someone with them. A boy. His stomach clenched. He knew what they were planning. The leader of the raiders stepped forward, giving orders. They were preparing to cook the boy. He had to act fast. Crawling through the filth, he reached the boy and used the pocket knife to cut his bindings. The boy screamed. One of the raiders glanced over but dismissed it. The son tried again, whispering, "I'm helping you." This time the boy hesitated. Then he ran. The injured raider stepped outside, looking around, but saw nothing. He grumbled and went back inside. The son turned to the real prize, the locked suitcase. He knew the medicine was inside. He reached for it, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard voices. The raiders were coming. He slid beneath the trailer, heart pounding as boots stomped above him. The leader was angry. He hit the injured raider for letting the boy escape. Then he checked his suitcase. His expression darkened. He saw something. Mud on the lock. The son cursed under his breath. The leader straightened, eyes narrowing. Someone's here. The son held his breath. The leader stormed off, and the camp fell into uneasy silence. The son exhaled. He had one chance. He would steal the key, get the medicine, and get his father back. The night was still, but the son could feel the weight of unseen eyes in the dark. The key hung from the leader's neck, inches away from his grasp. The trailer was suffocatingly quiet, the air thick with the stench of sweat and rot. The raiders lay tangled together in restless sleep, their weapons within arm's reach. If he woke them, he wouldn't make it out alive. He reached forward slowly, the blade of his pocket knife pressed against the thin rope holding the key. The leader stirred, mumbling in his sleep. The son froze. He could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Any sound would be his end. The blade sliced through the rope. The key fell into his palm. He exhaled, barely allowing himself relief. Then he moved. Crawling backward, he reached the door and slipped outside. The night air was sharp against his sweat-damp skin. His hands trembled as he fit the key into the suitcase lock. It clicked open. Inside, his fingers found the small, familiar bottle. The medicine. A breath of pure relief escaped him. Then the realization. He wasn't safe yet. He turned, stepping away, but his foot caught something. A wire. A loud snap echoed through the night. The trap. The camp exploded into motion, shouts, the rapid shuffle of feet. He ran, shoving the suitcase shut and throwing it aside, sprinting toward the exit. He barely made it 3 steps before an arrow flew past his head, burying itself into the dirt. He ran faster. He reached the camp's edge and lunged for the wooden barricade, climbing over it as another arrow pierced his leg. He hit the ground hard, pain tearing through him, but he didn't stop. Behind him, the raiders were closing in. The leader's voice cut through the chaos. "Get him!" The son forced himself forward, gripping his bleeding leg, stumbling through the trees. His lungs burned. The cold bit into his exposed skin. Then the wolves howled. The sound sent a ripple of fear through the forest. He could hear the raiders hesitate. They knew what that meant. The son kept running. Somewhere ahead, his home waited. His girlfriend, weak and fevered, was counting on him. His father was gone, but she was still here. She still needed him. He wouldn't fail. His body ached, but he pushed forward, his steps uneven. He reached the ruins of the old man's house, but the door hung open, broken. The wolves had been here. Inside, only bones remained. A sudden, sharp impact from behind sent him sprawling. They had caught up. A raider tackled him, slamming him to the ground. The son struggled, his fingers reaching for his knife, but the raider pinned him down. Then silence. The son looked up. His attacker was staring at something behind them, his face twisted in sudden terror. The wolves had arrived. The raider barely had time to scream before they were on him. The son scrambled away, heart hammering as the pack descended. He didn't watch. He didn't wait. He ran. Ahead he could see the outline of home, branches concealing the hidden doorway. His chest ached with hope, with exhaustion, with desperation. Then something struck him hard from the side. The leader. The impact sent them both rolling. The son gasped, clutching at the ground, trying to rise, but the leader was faster. He grabbed the son by the collar, yanking him up, slamming him against a tree. The leader's breath was ragged, his coat was torn, his face was lined with rage. "You," he snarled. The son gritted his teeth, pain flaring in his ribs. His knife was gone, his bow was broken. He had nothing left. The leader pulled his blade free, pressing it against the son's throat. "You took everything from me," the leader hissed. "My people, my home, my wife." His grip tightened. "And now I take from you." The son saw it in his eyes, the intent, the end. But then, the howls. Louder this time, closer. The leader faltered. The son didn't. With the last of his strength, he drove his knee into the leader's gut. The man staggered, his grip loosening just enough. The son ripped free, reaching for the smaller gun in his waistband. He didn't hesitate. The shot rang out. The leader collapsed. Blood pooled beneath him. He twitched once, then went still. The son didn't wait to see if he was truly dead. He grabbed the medicine and ran. When he reached home, the branches covering the entrance were disturbed. The door was slightly open. His stomach dropped. He stumbled inside, gasping. Empty. No. He staggered through the house, searching. The blankets where she had been lying were crumpled. The air was too still, too quiet. She was gone. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. His body shook, exhaustion and horror sinking into his bones. Then, a touch on his shoulder, software, gentle. His breath caught. He turned.